Until recently, aestheticism and arts and crafts were held to have very different origins and largely incompatible motivations. We might argue that the contrasting politics of the two movements are played out in their display strategies. Aesthetic exhibitions, with their emphasis on creating a harmonious environment for the viewer, reinforced the movement's preoccupation with consumption, whereas the democratic policies of arts and crafts exhibitions represented that movement's concern with production. Lately, however, new scholarship on the period has challenged the prevailing view that aestheticism and arts and crafts were directly opposed to one another, and has even questioned the helpfulness of calling either a movement with a coherent agenda. Though there were, of course, many differences between aesthetic and arts and crafts exhibitions, they also had much in common. They were, in large part, motivated by the inflexibility and exclusivity of the Royal Academy. Their critics often responded as much to the conditions of display as to the individual objects, and they experimented with the ideal of the ensemble as an organizing principle. The exhibition policies associated with arts and crafts and aestheticism represented innovative approaches to decorative arts in particular. While they may have done so from different directions, both movements participated in unifying fine and decorative art. Aesthetic exhibitions displayed paintings surrounded by carefully selected decorative art, arguably domesticating fine art, while arts and crafts exhibitions elevated decorative arts to a position in which they could be judged on the same terms as fine arts. I suggest that when both movements took on the question of the relationship between fine and decorative art, the question of display arose as one of the fundamental issues to be dealt with. And the crucial problem surrounded the tension between the low status of domestic art and the desire to incorporate art in everyday life. Both movements addressed this issue by exhibiting decorative art in ways that associated it both with the high status of fine art and with the practicality of domestic space. Whistler famously revolutionized exhibition practices, most notably through his own one-man shows and at the Society of British Artists. Particularly important were his reduction of the number of exhibits and his reconstitution of the exhibition space along the lines of a domestic interior. By trimming down exhibitions to a mere 2 rows of relatively generously spaced objects, Whistler communicated the assumption that individual exhibits merited more sustained contemplation than those squeezed into the floor-to-ceiling display policy modeled on the Royal Academy exhibitions. Significantly, this new approach was presented in an environment that was clearly codified as domestic space, as contemporaries recognized, observing, for example, that the arrangement of the room will be a lesson to aesthetic visitors in the now favorite amusement of domestic decoration. Surrounding paintings with carefully curated textiles, porcelain, and tinted walls, Whistler implicitly suggested that domestic interiors could be the most promising site for a sophisticated engagement with art. Shortly after Whistler's groundbreaking experiments at the Society of British Artists, the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society was founded in protest against the Royal Academy's restriction to fine arts. It was the Society's goal to provide a chance for decorative artists to appeal to the public eye upon strictly artistic grounds in the same sense as the pictorial artist. It was the status the Society sought for such objects that made their exhibitions radical. When it was first established, the Society struggled to be taken seriously in the art world. According to Charles Robert Ashby, a Royal Academician responded to Ashby's claim that the arts and crafts exhibitions should be held at the Academy with the retort, "My dear young man, you surely don't expect us artists to allow our galleries to be turned into a furniture shop?" A furniture shop was precisely what the Society needed to distinguish itself from, It thus modelled itself on fine art exhibitions. Instead of combining objects into room-like arrangements, which was a common display strategy in commercial spaces, the arts and crafts exhibitions put objects on walls and in cabinets. But the Society's display strategy shifted over time, moving away from a museum-style display towards the ensemble. As Morna O'Neill has shown, this change was motivated partly by the Society's reception at the Turin exhibition of 1902, where its display contrasted sharply with those of other countries, which were organised into sample room ensembles. O'Neill cites a critic who observed that the Society's display at the Turin exhibition would have been better had the works been treated less like pictures and related more to daily use and environment. Meanwhile, both aesthetic and arts and crafts display strategies extended into spaces that blurred the domestic and the public, such as Leighton House. Between them, aesthetic and arts and crafts exhibitions paved the way for a new type of engagement with decorative art. It was, they argued, as worthy of contemplation as paintings, and that contemplation could as easily, perhaps even more effectively, take place in domestic settings as in public galleries. But what might that new engagement with decorative art look like? How do we take it seriously as the focus of contemplation, while letting it remain compatible with the distractions and practicalities of everyday life? In 2002, the everyday life theorist Ben Highmore asked, "Things become everyday by becoming invisible, unnoticed, part of the furniture. How then do we strip the everyday of its inconspicuousness? By what means do we resuscitate something that fails to interest us?" These were questions that also preoccupied the protagonists of the aesthetic and arts and crafts movements. One place to look for answers is in the work of William Morris. As I will show in the remainder of my paper, Morris demonstrated how decorative art could be both intellectually ambitious and suited to everyday life. According to Morris, a pattern should require a certain degree of concentration from the viewer, but not too much. It should be visually complex enough to lull the viewer's curiosity to trace it out, but it should not offer endless complexity, while there should be a certain mystery, and we should not be able to read the whole thing at once. The obvious presence of a geometric order should limit this mystery and prevent our feeling restless over a pattern. Poppy represents this balance. Like many of Morris's designs, Poppy is dominated by a powerful scroll format. We may think we can identify an S shape due to the thick, obtrusive stem that describes powerful curves, but our eye is reading as an S what is in fact a more complex and continuous pattern. The stem disappears into a blossom and then emerges again, only to disappear once more into a second blossom, close to which a second stem curves back upwards to turn the S into a figure 8, which is completed by a poppy from which the initial stem emerges and begins the S shape once more. As we follow the stem, there are frequent invitations to leave the path of the S or the 8 and explore the journeys of the shoots, petals, and leaves, which often interweave and overlap one another. Because there is more than one way of tracing the pattern, Poppy can sustain our interest for an extended time, yet our eye will eventually become aware that in each direction the same motif is repeated, reducing the sense of mystery. Poppy thus conforms to Morris's rule that we should not be able to read the whole thing at once, while also possessing an underlying order that prevents the viewer from feeling restless. Morris's patterns thus offer a balance between mystery and restlessness, and a sense of increasing discovery that become apparent when they are contemplated over a period of time. We might characterize the sense of progress conveyed during an encounter with Poppy as something akin to narrative, and indeed Morris speaks of pattern's mystery, of the viewer's curiosity, and of our ability to read it. One might protest that it makes little sense to talk of narrative in decorative art, which rarely represents the human figure. Some examples, perhaps, lend themselves more easily toward this kind of interpretation than others. Patterns such as bird and peacock and dragon, for example, include creatures whose interactions constitute a kind of dialogue. On the left, birds look over their shoulders at one another or hover close together with overlapping wings, while on the right, dragons and peacocks are locked in confrontation. Yet, narrative can be identified even in those patterns that do not represent animal life. As Caroline Arscott has argued, we should not see the ornamental features of Morris's designs as precluding narrative. I suggest that Morris's designs share at least two characteristics with narrative. First, they communicate meaning, and secondly, they convey that meaning over time. Or perhaps it is more appropriate to identify these characteristics not in the patterns themselves, but in the viewer's engagement with them. In Morris's patterns, narrative can be communicated compositionally or symbolically, and in both cases, nature is fundamental. Morris points to composition as the source of meaning when he declares that rational growth is necessary to all patterns, or at least the hint of such growth. And in recurring patterns, at least, the noblest are those where one thing grows visibly and necessarily from another. In vine, we see an example of this rational growth. If we look closely at the willow pattern in the background, we begin to see how one thing grows visibly and necessarily from another. A main willow stem leads vertically upwards, from which additional stems periodically emerge, and these in turn sprout new growth, sometimes splitting and sometimes producing smaller offshoots. Twisting under, over, and through itself and the vine motif, the willow leads our eye on a journey. Like a maze, it sometimes leads into a dead end, when a stem tails off into a cluster of leaves, but we can backtrack and follow another stem in a different direction. In this example, the composition works together with the subject matter to convey a sense of narrative. For Morris believes that nature also introduces narrative symbolically. He declares that he must still insist on plenty of meaning in your patterns, must have unmistakable suggestions of gardens and fields, and strange trees, boughs, and tendrils. He claims that what we want to clothe our walls with is something which reminds us of life beyond itself, which has the impress of human imagination strong on it. This implies that decoration works together with the viewer's imagination to create meaning, so that the meaning comes into being whenever the decoration is observed, and can be different for each observer. Narrative is thus generated by an interplay between the viewer's mind and that of the maker. The collective effect of objects experienced in an ensemble can also be interpreted as a kind of narrative in which meaning is generated through juxtaposition. Such collections of objects work together in a way we might describe as organic, since each part is subordinate to a whole from which it derives greater significance. In Pimpernel, leaves and stems weave their way over and under one another throughout the pattern. The impression given by these interactions is of an ongoing conversation in which different plants coexist harmoniously. There is no final resolution to be drawn from this pattern, in which the dialogue taking place between the different forms is continuous, like the relationship between the interwoven threads of a tapestry. The Pimpernel wallpaper decorated the dining room at Morris's Kelmscott house, and we find further examples of dialogue if we look beyond the pattern to its surroundings. The large poppy blossoms resonate with the similarly sized flowers depicted in the Persian carpet, which stretches from floor to ceiling on the eastern wall. These blossoms also echo the shape and size of the plates arranged on shelves along the adjoining south wall. The Pimpernel wallpaper thus provides a link between the two walls that seem to be designed according to entirely different principles, one representing classical symmetry, proportion, and discipline, and the other a larger-than-life collection of juxtaposed ornament. Pursuing the idea that Morris's ensembles generate dialogue and narrative, we might see the Pimpernel wallpaper as a mediator in this particular case, helping to establish harmony. A similar function is performed by the vine wallpaper in the morning room at 1 Holland Park, which was decorated by Morris & Co. in the 1880s. Vine's bold, scrolling formation echoes the emphatic twisting and canthus leaves in the forest tapestry on the left, thereby providing a sense of unity throughout the room. Next to the forest, a classically inspired mantelpiece introduces a powerful verticality that contrasts with the pronounced horizontality of the tapestry. Vine, whose scroll format gives it both verticality and horizontality, helps to generate an overall sense of balance. Again, the wallpaper is a mediator that blends aspects of the room's different components to create a sense of harmony. The organicism that can be found both within and between Morris's patterns often communicates harmony or unity, since no element is allowed to dominate. This balance may explain why a viewer might continue to be interested in engaging with a pattern or with an ensemble in everyday life. This is a narrative without a conclusion. Instead, it is an ongoing dialogue in which exchange and conflict between the different elements is maintained. The sense of balance and harmony has the potential to suspend the viewer's consciousness of time passing and ground the viewer in the present moment. One very straightforward way in which a viewer can be made aware of presentness is demonstrated by Strawberry Thief. Here, mischievous birds are eternally frozen in the act of stealing fruit, with the result that the viewer may have a sensation of time standing still. Yet the processes by which Morris's designs can keep us in the present are both more sophisticated and more flexible than this example suggests. Morris declares, "Now it is one of the chief uses of decoration, the chief part of its alliance with nature, that it has to sharpen our dulled senses. Decoration plays a crucial role in heightening the viewer's awareness of his or her surroundings." Morris compares this function of decoration to the effects of nature, and a close study of his letters helps us to understand why. Morris frequently describes the present moment to his correspondents in terms of his perception of nature. Whether in the town or the country, at home or at the factory, Morris is acutely aware of his surroundings at all times. From Kelmscott Manor, "I am sitting now 10 p.m. in the tapestry room, the moon rising red through the east wind haze, and a cow lowing over the fields." Or, "I'm writing among the grey gables and rook-haunted trees, with a sense of the place being almost too beautiful to work in." Or from Kelmscott House, "I am sitting in my room with the leaves dancing about in the sunshine on the table and the water sparkling outside so that it looks quite pretty." Or from Merton Abbey, "I find my room here and a view of the winter garden, with the men spreading some pieces of chintz on the bleaching ground, somewhat of consolation." These experiences become extraordinary because nature functions to sharpen Morris's senses. Using Morris's understanding of nature as a model, then, we can get a sense of how he expects decoration to have a comparable effect. What characteristics should a piece of decorative art possess if it is to sharpen our dulled senses? Morris's sense of the place being almost too beautiful to work in suggests an answer to this question. Beauty, it seems, is what nature and decoration alike can offer to sharpen our senses. Morris describes the lesser arts as that great body of art by means of which men have at all times more or less striven to beautify the familiar matters of everyday life. For Morris, the beautification of everyday life and the sharpening of our dulled senses are related. The beauty of Morris's ideal decoration not only works to sharpen our dulled senses, but also sustains our interest. As Ruskin writes, "For when we are interested by the beauty of a thing, the oftener we can see it, the better. But when we are interested only in the story of a thing, we get tired of hearing the same tale told over and over again and stopping always at the same point. Beauty, according to Ruskin, makes us want to keep looking and keep coming back to look. Our reward as we do so is not a new chapter in an inexhaustible story, but instead the experience of looking itself. The oftener we can see it, the better." For Ruskin, beauty is something to be contemplated in the present and for the sake of the present. Similarly, for Morris, when our dulled senses perceive beauty, in the familiar matters of everyday life, they are sharpened, making us more aware of our present. As Elizabeth Pretjohn has argued, a work of art's beauty is in the present moment of the observer's judgment. If we were only interested in the Pimpernel wallpaper for its intriguing interwoven pattern, we might soon get tired of it and require a new pattern to entertain us. If, however, we are interested by the beauty of it, the oftener we can see it, the better. Of course, the question of whether Pimpernel is beautiful is a separate issue altogether, but assuming that we do find it beautiful, our contemplation of its beauty would involve retracing its design, an experience we would begin to appreciate less for its novelty and more for its aesthetic rewards as time went on. If we find the Pimpernel wallpaper beautiful, its capacity to sharpen our dulled senses need not diminish as we become more familiar with it. While an object may, in our contemplation of it, emphasize the present, this does not necessarily mean that our experience of it will always be the same. The potential for change in our encounter with an object from one day or even one moment to the next allows the object to keep sharpening our dulled senses. This can be seen if we look at Kennet, one of the printed textiles Morris named after tributaries of the Thames. If we imagine Kennet hanging against a wall as it did at Kelmscott Manor, the pattern falls in folds before us. Parts of the design are visible to us, while others are invisible or hidden in shadow. If we return again the next day, changes may have occurred. The act of opening and closing the door may have caused the chintz to flutter in the draught and settle slightly differently, or brighter sunshine may throw darker shadows into the recessed folds. Like the water after which it is named, the surface of Kennet is never the same. It ripples and reflects the conditions around it. Morris advises that your stuff is pretty sure to be used falling into folds, so that there will be plenty of light and shade on it, which will give subordinate incident. These terms, light and shade and incident, are again suggestive of narrative. Because the environmental factors that endow the pattern with incident are uncontrollable, the viewer's experience of the object at a particular moment may never be replicated. That specific encounter takes place only in the present, and because we know we cannot take it for granted, it may sharpen our dulled senses into appreciating the moment. I would like to close by suggesting that this connects Morris's view of the purpose of decorative art to aestheticism. Morris's description of art sharpening our dulled senses echoes Walter Pater's famous claim that art should make one burn always with a hard, gem-like flame, and give the highest quality to your moments as they pass, and simply for those moments' sake. Being in the present is a crucial part of Pater's aesthetic experience. Thus, when Morris's patterns aim to sharpen our dulled senses, they offer the possibility of a Paterian moment. Morris elsewhere describes an experience that sounds very much like Pater's ideal. Once or twice I had that delightful quickening of perception by which everything gets emphasized and brightened, and the commonest landscape looks lovely, anxieties and worries, though remembered, yet no weight on one's spirits, heaven in short. A delightful sensory presentness is a state of being desired by both Morris and Pater. The implications of aestheticism for everyday life were, of course, heavily ridiculed by satirists such as George du Maurier in his Punch cartoons. Aesthetes neglecting their children for the love of China, or contemplating lilies instead of eating lunch, demonstrated the undesirable consequences of allowing aesthetic experience to replace the ordinary activities of everyday life. According to critics, aestheticism invested everyday objects such as teapots with a disproportionate significance, comprehensible only to an elite group. In contrast, Morris's approach to decorative art is usually understood in a democratic sense, and that he expanded the boundaries of art to include not only the familiar matters of everyday life, but also a broader audience. Aestheticism and arts and crafts in their most extreme forms are thus conventionally opposed to one another. Yet the temporal implications of Morris's designs suggest that the two may in fact be closely connected. As Liz Pretjohn has argued, Aestheticism's famous art for art's sake dictum can be interpreted as posing the question, what would art be like if it were not for the sake of anything else? Morris's design seemed to ask what each moment would be like if we were to live it not for the sake of anything else, but for its own sake. Similarly, Pater's approach invites us to interpret art for art's sake as art for each moment's sake. Aestheticism, in its emphasis on the sensory experience of art, makes a case for living in the present similar to Morris's. Both aesthetic and arts and crafts exhibitions, by featuring ensembles and evoking domestic space, propose that art should be part of everyday life. Morris's design philosophy demonstrates some of the implications of those display strategies for the design and interpretation of decorative art. Thanks.